Princess.
I said, bitch, I don't really think nobody real, as they say. I said, bitch, what the fuck they talk about? I said, bitch, you was never there, do minimum wage. I said, bitch, you was never there when I was trying to get paid. I said, bitch, you better pick your friend right. I said, bitch, some ain't gon' be there when you want them to. I said, since I turned 19, I said a lot of shit I learned. I said, bitch, nobody ain't gon' be there when you want them to. I said, bitch, you better go with your move. I said, bitch, you got a dream. I said, bitch, you better chase it. I said, bitch, sometimes I don't believe my cousin gone. I said, bitch, I can feel the spirit inside my room. I said, bitch, don't know who to trust no more. I said, bitch, my trust fucked up. I said, bitch, don't know who to run to no more. I said, bitch, it seem like ain't nobody ain't real no more. I said, bitch, you better not trust these duck hoes. I said, bitch, I ain't worrying about none. I said, bitch, if I ain't about each other. I said, bitch, I ain't worrying about it. I said, bitch, you better not hit my phone. I said, bitch, I got time. I said, bitch, I don't wanna talk. I said, bitch, I had too many losses, you was never there. I said, bitch, all y'all do is talk too much. I said, bitch, I got all that shit off the ground. I said, bitch, I ain't never had no help. I said, bitch, what the fuck they talk about? I said, bitch, I was wishing for a lot of shit change, and I found out everybody changed. I said, bitch, I stay the same. I said, bitch, I stayed in my lane. I said, bitch, I ain't never hated on nobody. I said, bitch, that ain't in my dictionary. I said, bitch, I want everybody to win, but I don't want you sitting at my table. I said, bitch, I'm about whatever. I said, bitch, I know some real steppers. I said, bitch, they get you gone. I said, bitch, I'm tryna hop on the phone. I said, bitch, I'm just tryna roll my weed and get out my zone. I said, bitch, I ain't got time. I said, bitch, just leave me alone. I don't got time. I said, bitch, you don't wanna see that side. I said, bitch, I remember time I was kicking doors. I said, bitch, you know I'm throwing foes. I said, bitch, you know it's 4L. I said, bitch, I remember time we was in ladder on. I said, bitch, nobody couldn't tell us shit. I said, bitch, you know it's free, nah. I said, bitch, everybody got a date. I said, bitch, play with me, you good. 772 to your head. I don't get no fuck. I said, bitch, I been seeing red. I said, bitch, you know it's fuck the fit.